Welcome to Essential Coaching Conversations with Kyle and Aseem.
The real, relevant, and necessary coaching conversations to help you navigate coaching, teaching, learning, and life.
Welcome back to episode 6 of Essential Coaching Conversations with Kyle and Aseem. Kyle, I don't know about you, but I am just extremely grateful that, number one, again, there's a very low bar to getting in on the podcast game and a very low barrier of entry. But number two, that people are actually listening to this. So at the time of recording, we're at almost 300 total listens, which is like 294 more than we thought we were ever going to have. So I don't know about you, but I'm extremely grateful for all the people that have taken it out of their time, or taken time out of their schedule to listen, and not just listen, but shoot us a text or a DM or something like that, telling us that they found value in what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think we mentioned this maybe in a previous episode, and not so much asking for like the pressing of the 5-star button. We want you to reach out to us and keep the conversation going, and we want to know how the conversation is impacting you and the thoughts that might bring up to you. And to your credit, the audience out there, that's exactly what y'all have done. And we're constantly getting hit with DMs, emails, text messages, people that that come by that know us, or maybe we work with, that are popping in the office and talking about this is what they heard, and this is kind of how it's hitting them and what it's making them think in some kind of light. And so again, it's really, really cool. Yes, it is very low bar to actually sit here and do this. It's that part's not necessarily the difficult part. The difficult part, I think, is showing up and staying consistent with it, and then trying to have these conversations like we do, and then just hoping that somebody else is interested in what we're having to say. And so far, yeah, we're off to a pretty good start, I would say. And I guess you could say that maybe we've set a particular standard at this point, with so many listens. And so we're sort of laughing right now, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Is the standard is the standard, right? What are our standards? We are seeing a lot of content floating around with back to school, back to seasons. There's a lot of team meetings that are taking place, getting your players back on campus. Colleges, high schools, junior highs, a lot of faculty meetings are taking place around the country right now, going through their PD days, having to sit here and listen to their administrations talking about, hey, we're going to all have a really great year. Here are the rules. If you just do exactly what I tell you to do, we're going to be okay this year, right? And so we sort of get the rule book and we have our meeting, and then we just sort of move on and pray that everybody sort of follows along. So today we're going to talk a little bit about maybe reframing and rethinking and restructuring, how we go about defining even what a standard actually is. And we'll just sort of see kind of how, where this takes us. I think there's a number of different directions that we could end up going with this. But that seems to be, I don't know, the hot topic at the moment. Is all right, we're all back together again. We're super excited about being back together. We talked some about the countdowns. Everybody has a countdown to day one. There's not a whole lot of countdowns to day 2 or day 3. Mm-hmm. We usually count down to day 1, and right around Christmas, we count down to the last day. But it's what are we doing in between day 1 and day last, that is going to get us where we need to go. What's going to ultimately define us as successful or unsuccessful. And I think we can even get into talking about the varying degrees in between what success and not success might actually be.
Yeah, and I think to that point, especially right now, so we're recording this kind of mid to late August, and people are going through their preseasons and trying to find that edge that everybody's trying to find. And there's a lot of excitement, and there's a lot of I think trying to install different things. And I think even when we think about standards, I think standards are a good thing, right? We have our own standard setting activity that's been really successful for a lot of teams. And like standards are good, but I don't think they're enough. And I think if we're trying to do standard setting and standard explanation and brainstorming and things like that as part of this install period, we tend to look at them too as something that has been installed and thus is fixed as part of a binary. So you can think of any number of sort of the buzzwordy type things. So red versus green, above the line or below the line, things like that. And we'll get into some of that here today, but I think we need to sort of be able to look at what standards actually do for us and how effective we are at framing what the standard is versus what it could be. And I think that's the next step for us in essential coaching in our own evolution when we're doing programming with teams, when we're trying to think of ways to uh, reconsider how we get to elite level performance and we empower coaches, as our tagline is empowering coaches, how we empower coaches to really hone in on raising the bar and helping their team understand what elite performance is actually going to be in every aspect of the program. It doesn't mean we're always going to reach it, but I think if we're just doing either acceptable or unacceptable, red or green, or above the line or below the line, we've lost all the nuance that is provided by a spectrum of those behavioral things versus just the binary of those behavioral things.
Well, we're not either on or off, right? Like we're too complicated. We're all human beings. We're not robots. And when we talk about the human component and sort of factoring in that we are dealing with real breathing human beings every single day, that everybody's day is a little bit different. Players are different from drill to drill, rep to rep, one bad call to the next. Students are different, subject to subject, period to period, based on who they might have seen or not seen on the sidewalk or, in the hallway heading to class. We all have these varying degrees of good versus bad, above the line versus below the line. We all have these varying degrees of what might be acceptable or unacceptable to us. And then having to fit all of that within the context of a team, an organization, a program, a society. And so, like we mentioned, the rule books, and again, this is not a knock on like the word standard. Like you said, standards are very much a good thing, but we like to look at these things through the lens of good, better, and best. And so if standards are good, then, or if a rule book is good, let's say standards are better, what is the best? How do we take that and how do we move that? And I think a lot of coaches are probably sitting there right now thinking like, oh, we'll just raise the bar. We'll just raise the standard. We'll move to the next thing. And it's like, well, if the standard is the standard, then you're going to change that all of a sudden. Then who goes about changing what it is? Who decides when it's time to move it? Do we ever have to change that standard and go backwards? Because I think there's another part to this where if the standard is too high and we can't achieve it, and we were sort of shooting for the moon, as it were, but we don't taste any success, and our players, our students, or anything are constantly facing failure over and over and over again, and they start to feel like they're not good enough, or they have doubts about themselves. We talk a lot about, belief moving efficacy. You've got to believe in what you're doing and understand that you've got the opportunity to be successful, because nobody wants to be a failure. Nobody wants to disappoint their parent, their coach, their teacher, their friend, their teammate. Everybody wants to be a part of something. I think optimistically that people have that inner drive to want to be successful and want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. While at the same time, we talked a couple episodes ago about self-interest and selfishness. We're all going to have some of that, right? But we get that warm, fuzzy feeling when we were a part of something bigger than ourselves. And again, how do we sort of fit all of this nuance where everybody is different every single day? And this is where we can talk about, art, leadership, education, the art of all of that versus the science of it. We can't just have this formulaic, hey, roll this out and just expect it to work every single time. And I think that's where we as coaches, educators, leaders, parents, even, we fall into that trap, because it's like, well, this worked, last year, this worked 10 years ago, this worked 30 years ago. Why is it not working now?
And that's where we fail to take into account, to sum up what you said, failing to take into account the human component. And that's something that I think on a later episode, we're going to really address what this concept of the human component means. Because I think, especially coaches who are sort of set in their ways, or they may not understand fully what we're talking about, this idea of the human component being the foundation and the driving force behind everything we do is exactly what Kyle just said. There is a lot of buzzwordy crap that's out there of we got to give 110% every day. We get the standard is the standard, this, that, and the other. Body language matters the most, which we talked about on our last episode. That's what's going to differentiate you from person to person. Realistically, none of that is possible or true. And so if we're able to individualize the spectrum for people's character, the habits we are trying to get them to have, and we can assess them as individuals to say, hey, today you were here, tomorrow you are here. Let's try not to backslide. But even if you do, we can ascertain what the reason is for that backslide. That is far more effective than saying, well, you just didn't meet the standard, so you're not going to play. You as the coach have to be the standard bearer. You have to be the one who is operating at the edge of your ability at that sort of elite level in order to bring somebody else with you to that. And that's where I think, too, we get into a lot of trouble. And maybe we're getting a little off topic here, but this is kind of just what we do in hiring practices. When we say we're going to hire former players, that might be well and good. Go ahead and do that. But if that person doesn't have the ability or the demonstrated experience or knowledge of how to create an environment where elite performance is possible, because there is that psychological safety that you talked about, where that self-talk will be something that is taught, where the standard is not just the standard and it's part of this binary, it's part of this, like, you either did or you didn't, and we are going to penalize you if you don't. That right there is the art that you're talking about of coaching. And so when I think about even that concept of, okay, we have, let's use Urban Meyer's above the line, below the line thing as an example. How far above the line creates a new line? Do coaches even know? Or do they romanticize the idea of this one kid or these two kids maybe being the ones who are so far above the line that everybody should aspire to be like them, without defining and operationalizing the things that make those people special? And also not penalizing kids who are doing what we have just said is above the line or is the standard as the bare minimum. Which is why I think, as we were talking about planning in this episode, this idea just kept coming back to us of, if we're saying the standard is the standard, we're essentially saying this is the bare minimum acceptable that is going to get us where we want to go. And if we handle this, we have put ourselves in a better position than if we didn't handle it. But it doesn't mean that we're going to strive for excellence, but those are the things that we're telling our teams to do, that we want them to strive for excellence, that they have to work hard, that they have to do more than is expected. But when we go and let's say you've defined your standards or your green traits or you're above the line or whatever, any of these programmatic things that exist, we have told them what the bare minimum is, or they have decided what the bare minimum is going to be, or maybe the aspirational above the bare minimum. And when they do those things, if those things aren't celebrated as, hey, yeah, you did meet the standard, and it's just expected that that's going to happen, you eventually take high achievers who are used to pushing themselves and saying, like, all right, this is just enough to get up. And we then, and maybe I'm sort of bringing up multiple points here that we're going to have to go back and talk about. We have misalignment when we say, like, strive for excellence, but we're only really giving the kids who have the most talent or who have already earned the most playing time the chance to continue, even though they are not the ones that are striving for that excellence. I don't believe that it's true that the best player on your team is going to be the hardest worker on your team. I think that's a pie in the sky coach speak ideal, but the hardest worker on your team is likely the kid who doesn't play a lot. We've already established that in our previous conversations. Mm-hmm. But when we talk about the standard and when we talk about raising that bar, and that's something that, you know, we can share a story about Gino Auriemma here in a second, but the kids who are doing that, if those things are also not being celebrated and operationalized for the rest of the team, now we have a tremendous misalignment. And when we've done our research on vision roadblocks, when that standard keeps moving and we don't actually know what it is, or we're celebrating the wrong things after we've defined the things we said we want to be about, that's where the most confusion comes from for our athletes.
I think one of the pitfalls here is not, I think there's two ways that players or employees, students ultimately end up getting punished when we talk about standards, especially if we're looking at it from this. And again, this is not to knock standards, but like you just said, we are essentially defining what the bare minimum is. But then we as coaches go back and we hate the fact that we have players that only do the bare minimum. And so we'll end up lamenting that they don't do more, or that they don't do that and then some. They don't do that extra degree, you know, the whole 212 movement of just that one extra degree that gets us to boiling or whatever. You know, we have players and we set this line. We have players that do right at that line, or maybe just above it. And then we don't like the fact that there's a whole nother group that are doing more than that. And so we lament them, or we punish them, or we don't reward them in a way that we should, you know, and it's like, well, why should I just reward you for doing your job? We hear that a lot. Mm-hmm. And it's like, yeah, okay, you don't necessarily have to, but where's the harm in doing it? Especially if we're going to tie this back to that idea that belief moves efficacy, and that our two most important factors of performance are engagement and motivation. Like, is it really that difficult to praise somebody, to tell them that they did a good job? You know, is it really that difficult to compliment somebody on quote unquote just doing their job? And then we get upset with them because they don't want to do more. Well, how likely are they to do more? Well, if we can engage them and motivate them by praising them for meeting that standard, then we are more likely, I think, to kind of drive them towards the rest of the group that might be a little bit further ahead of them.
And maybe, and I'm so glad you said that. And I just wrote this down in my notes because I think this is something that happens to every program that engages in some sort of this activity every year. We start off with a tremendous amount of excitement, right? And I think this is where hopefully coaches, you turn up the volume a little bit, because I think I might be describing your experience. We start off with a tremendous amount of excitement. Maybe we bring in somebody from outside to help us. We're really pumped to be there. Maybe school hasn't started yet if you're a fall sport, you know, or we're starting maybe closer to winter break. Kids are really pumped, whatever it is. And there's all this activation energy that goes into the beginning of the season. We define all these behaviors we think are important. And then we do probably one of the worst things we can do is say that accountability is one of our values, and that we're going to hold each other accountable. Every coach in the country, in the world, has probably said the phrase, you got to hold each other accountable. To me, and really to us, accountability is not just when things go wrong. And I think we have to reframe what accountability means before we can even reframe what standards are. And so I say all that to say this: celebration is a form of accountability. If we just take the word accountable or holding someone to account, we are literally saying this is what happened. That has no opinion or no intention behind it. So if somebody is hitting that standard, especially early after we've just defined what it is, and we are now planning our practices, we are now planning what we're doing around that, wouldn't it make sense to say that if I'm going to hold you accountable to the standard, it's a neutral statement to say, I will celebrate your successes in hitting those standards. I will celebrate your successes in exceeding those standards. And I will also hold you to account when you don't and help you create a pathway to that celebration. How much more would that move? And Kyle, I'm asking you this question. How much more do you think that that would improve that belief and that engagement and that motivation that then moves efficacy and performance forward?
I think it would be massively tremendous. And I go back to teaching, especially younger seventh, eighth, grades where kids are, 12, 13 years old. And I cannot get the kids out of my head that have one experience in one classroom and have a completely different experience in every other classroom. And they are seen to be sort of that below the standard type of kid, that they're below the line constantly in everything that they do, and that they're never gonna, get there or achieve it or go above it or any of those types of things. And I would be willing to bet that most of those kids in their minds, they are meeting some version of their standards, or they think that they are meeting your standard. But there is that misalignment there where they're like, well, I was doing what you were telling me to do, but I'm not so-and-so, and you love so-and-so. And so you just think that because I'm not them, I'm constantly getting, kind of crapped on as the bad kid, or the kid that can't do this, or the kid that can't do that. But then that same exact student goes across the hallway into another classroom with a different environment created where they are celebrated for where they are. They are held to account to maybe their particular area of gray that they are in. And eventually, over time, through relationship, through constant recruiting, through the things that we talk about a lot, that they eventually do get to where those other students might be, or where that other teacher's standard might be. And again, I think this is the art to all of this. It's that Goldilocks. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, and having to understand that everybody in the room is going to be in a slightly different place. And it's all well and good to have that standard and define it as something that's like, super high. It's way up there. We want to get there. But if we as the adults in the room are going to set a high standard, we then we can't take that out on everybody in the room who's not there yet, and understand that there has to be some of that growth mindset. Understand that nobody in that room at that particular moment, there's a chance that none of us are going to be where we want to be, especially consistently, right? Because the idea is not to just do this one off every now and then. It's our definition of character, to build the consistency of those positive habits, and not just hit the standard once, but to hit it, over and over and over and over and over again. And then maybe eventually, when the majority of our group gets there, we can start to kind of raise it. And you mentioned, if we go past the line and we get so far past the line, can we get so far past it that we can't recognize the line anymore? Can we get so far past it that we don't see it anymore? Is it time to then draw a new line in the sand? And going the other way too. If we fall so far below the line to where we don't recognize it or we can't set it anymore, do we need to then redraw that line? And a lot of coaches might say, well, no, there's no way we would do that. We would never lower our standards in the program. And it doesn't mean that we have to chisel that in stone. Maybe that line is just sort of chalked in temporarily, and then we start to inch our way back to where we were. But I've said this, and I know a lot of other coaches that have said it too, that we constantly go back to, well, that team 10 years ago did all of this, and you're nowhere near what they did. Let me tell you who doesn't care about the team 10 years ago. Your team right now. They don't care anything about the team from 10 years ago. They don't give two craps about what they accomplished and what they did. This is their team, and you shouldn't care about that team anymore either, because we should be focusing on what's happening right now in the room. And so that takes us, sort of pivots us into that climate versus culture topic, where your culture might be what you sort of romanticize it as, these sort of pie in the sky aspirations, like you said. But our climate is, we are what we are. That is what it is. The way our players feel is the way our players feel. Climate doesn't lie. culture lies to us all the time, but climate doesn't. And for us to be able to get back to where we are right now in the room within our shade of gray, I think that to me is where, if we're going to use the word elite, those are your elite leaders. Those are your elite coaches and your elite teachers and whoever, is sort of in charge in the room. That they are so in tuned that they have to go back to our buddy Layden talks a lot about the vibe in the room. They have a pulse on the vibe and they know how to turn that thermostat up or down because they're so attuned into not just the environment but to the people in that environment. And knowing that today was a great day, just because today was a great day does not guarantee that tomorrow is even a good day. And then on the flip side of that, today was a terrible day. That doesn't automatically mean that tomorrow is going to be terrible either. We can have a really bad warm up and play electric. We can have an electric warm up and be absolutely flat. A kid might have bad body language walking into the gym, but that doesn't define who they are or what type of practice they're about to have. Just as a kid might do every single thing that we told them to do in our rule book, it doesn't mean that they have high character when it comes to our pillars of play or our essential elements or the things that we say that we're going to be about on and off the field. And understanding that some kids are going to be really great on the academic side of things. Court, classroom, community, right? Yes, it would be great if somebody was elite at all three of those. If you've ever coached one of those, first, I'd probably call you a liar, but maybe you have. Maybe somebody out there actually has. But also understanding that somebody's eliteness in the classroom might not translate to the court, or somebody's eliteness to the court might not necessarily translate to the community. And ideally, we're working towards all three of those things, but not everybody is going to be, in that same vein. And so I come back to what are we doing as the leaders to recruit those players or students every day, and understanding that I'm going to have to sort of manipulate and turn those dials ever so slightly, every single day, every single conversation, which quite frankly sounds exhausting. And it is. But that's why we go back to our episodes on rest and recover. Like, how are we sort of building those things in? Because if we're not doing that, we definitely don't have the energy, the time, the wherewithal, the mental clarity, or just the energy or the want to dive into all these things beyond just, hey, here's the rule book. Mm-hmm. And if we're just handing a rule book, I feel like what we're ultimately saying is, here is forced compliance versus building actual character. And our bare minimum might be forced compliance, because at least if it's forced compliance and they'll just say, yes, sir, they'll just say, yes, ma'am, they'll just show up, they'll put their laundry back in the basket, they'll put the balls on the rack. That's one less headache I've got to have, right? Like those aren't bad things. Those are not going to keep us from, or cause us to fail. But those things are certainly not, forced compliance is certainly not going to move us forward in whatever quote unquote championship culture or eliteness or anything, striving for excellence. They're not going to get us there. So I think the question of this episode or two or three that it may turn into is, what are we actually striving towards? And how are we not just setting the standard in a bare minimum and saying, okay, this is where we are and we're okay being here. But what are the behaviors, the actionable things that we're doing that are actually driving us forward?
So I go back to what you said about recruiting, because I think this is where, and I gave a clinic about this last year, but redefining that recruiting phrase to not just be player acquisition, but recruiting everybody's heart and mind to the highest ideals of what we're trying to be about. And that's a skill, right? So when I think even in the hiring process, a lot of times people want to know what you're going to run. People want to know, how you're going to deal with conflict. And all of those things are somewhat important. But I think what you just talked about, probably for the last few minutes, is the most significant thing coaches can master. And that is creating the environment where we can turn those dials there's trust that when I do turn those dials, I have recruited enough of those kids to where when I turn something up or down, they understand why I'm doing that. But I, as the coach, am able to explain when I am doing that, why it matters. Right. So it's the same thing in player development. So there's a parallel here. Everybody in player development or in practice or whatever, like I think 10 years, 15 years have now gone by where like people still say like they gotta know the why. They gotta know the why. Duh. Like yes, they need to know the why, but they also need to know the when. Right. And so the same thing applies. So the context within they're going to use a move or they're going to finish or whatever, the same context applies to this. When do I turn it up? When do I turn it down? As a coach, can I create this environment? Can I manage this environment to where the players can thrive when they need to? Right? There is so much chaos that consumes the players, especially at the higher levels, but at any level. I mean, people are dealing with all kinds of crazy things in their lives. And whether it's just school, whether it's family things, whether it is nutrition, whether it is sleep, they haven't slept in a few days, maybe they're underhoused, maybe they have any number of things going on in their life. And yet here we're going to say like the most important thing is your commitment to this team. Here's how you showcase your commitment to this team. And then we expect them to do more than just the bare minimum that we have said is the standard. Right. So when we're talking about rule books, like I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a friend of mine recently. This person had attended a workshop for their particular sport, and really one of the things in the workshop was that they had taken all of these rule books and sort of guidebooks from Division 1 coaches and just kind of handed them out to the participants and said, hey, this is what you should aspire to do in your program. How damaging to every single program that just takes that verbatim and hits Control F and changes the name of the program, but keeps all the same things. So in one bucket, I guess, we've got those rules, we've got those things that have been copied from coach to coach and shared from coach to coach. And then you have this active process of setting standards, which is great. But if we're not able to couple those things with recruiting each other every day through the authenticity process, through creating connections, through creating trust, through actual communication and having mutual respect and creating those relationships with each other, not to say like, hey, I just want to be your friend, but I also want to compete with you. I want to strive together with you. And I can only do that if I can trust that you're going to bring your best. Well, once we've defined what we think is sort of the floor of what the best is, now it's up to the players, now it's up to the coaching staff to really turn the dials of that environment to say, all right, we can sort of push past what we said was the bare minimum. Once we are able to achieve 1 minute of what we've said is our standard, how do we push that forward? And so the impetus for this conversation is that good, better, best idea of like, there's the rules, there's the binary part of standards, above the line, below the line, red, green, etc. What's next? How do we say, like, if we're going to approach standard setting in our program as a spectrum, what's the next step of that spectrum? And so to me, that's where we talk about performance, right? So there's the goal, there's the rules, there's the standards, and then there's our actual aspiration for performance. There's the elite level of performance. And maybe there's some other word that we could come up with. Maybe it's character, right? When we talk about character being the repeatability of positive habits, eventually those standards should drive your character forward. And so if we're saying like the standard is what is acceptable here, how do we go one more level and say, all right, we've moved past acceptable into elite or into exceptional? Because I think, and Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you said this earlier, maybe when we were talking about planning this episode. How many of us know what elite level performance actually looks like?
I would be willing to bet it's not very many. And we have maybe an idea, And I think to your point earlier about levels, like if you said what's elite, a lot of people, we're basketball guys, right? Like a lot of people would say the Warriors are elite. Steph Curry
Hmm.
is elite. We go to the highest level, the NBA, we go to the NFL, we go to the tippity top of what, professional sports might be, or, whatever business that you're in. If you're a psychologist, you go to the, tippity top of the field. But I think the questions are valid to ask, like, what actually is elite? What actually is excellence? If we're going to strive for excellence, or we're going to you know put a lead on everything that we say, how do we even know that that is even possible? Is a lead or excellence even within our grasp? Is it relative from one thing to the next, from one level to the next? What is the difference between an elite Class B boys Louisiana basketball team versus an elite Division III women's basketball team versus an elite NBA team? Is there a
Hmm.
difference? Do we have to silo them in their respective areas? Are we comparing one thing to the next, or just, each division, as it were, to one another? What's the difference between an elite middle school science classroom versus an elite Fortune 500 boardroom?
Hmm.
And, I think when you're setting these and you're trying to say, okay, this is what our version of elite is it as simple as saying elite for us is the root of that competition, us striving together and pushing each other, and our competitiveness moving the standard forward? Whereas I was here and now, and we're just sort of one rung at a time on the ladder, moving ourselves towards, that next particular line where we might have to redefine, you know, what what that is. And I don't know if I have an I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think it's a really difficult question to ask, and it's a even more difficult question to answer, is what is sort of next. And when you get into this comparison game, and we start thinking about absolute versus relative success, I think we can get into that, the grass is greener, the Joneses, that fall into that trap of, okay, well, you know, this might be elite for us, but look at what elite is over there. But then again, like, how many of us really know what the very tippity top of that mountain actually feels like, tastes like, sounds like, or you know, how many of us really actually know what that takes? And then I think this is another question to sort of piggyback off our previous episodes: is trying to strive to get there even realistic or a healthy idea? Do we reach a point where we're, hashtag relentless, and we might be reaching these elite levels of certain things, but we become below the standard in other areas of our lives? I might be an elite coach, but my family is in shambles. I might be an elite this, but it's made me worse at that. And then how do we work life balance all of that and make sure that we're sort of holding ourselves to account in other areas of our lives? I might be holding my player accountable,
Mm.
but yet my wife needs to be holding me accountable to at home.
Hmm.
And that really is, again, coming back to the art and the nuance of a lot of this, being that how do we sort of turn the dials there and make sure that we don't have, too many eggs in one basket? And again, I might be sort of taking us down a different path, but sometimes we do that. With If we're going to strive for that, and this may be a conversation that we come back to in another time, is that pie in the sky aspiration of what elite actually is it even worth it for other areas of our life? And when you hear about stories about Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and blah blah blah, like, who's real, Tiger Woods, who's really willing to go to those depths? And then when you look at other aspects of those elite performers' lives, they couldn't be further from elite in those other areas. So I
Hmm.
think part of that question is, well, what are we willing to sacrifice over here to be elite at this? If we want to be elite defenders, does that mean we're going to have to sacrifice some things over here on the offensive end, or vice versa? Or do we have a congruent game model, where one side sort of sharpens the other, and then that way we can sort of build those together. But I think when you ask like, okay, well, we want to be a really great defensive team because we're less skilled on the offensive end, and that's sort of where our conversation ends, when we really should be taking that to, okay, well, if we want to be really good on defense, let's use that defensive mentality to raise us over here on the offensive side, or vice versa.
Yeah, it's one of those things too. And as you were talking, I was thinking like if I was to start over as a coach, where would I even start? Like, as most coaches start with the tactics of the game. And then they see everything through the lens of the tactics of the game, and they want to know more about X's and O's because they believe that's the edge their team is going to have. It's my firm belief, and I shared this working with a team recently. Everybody is looking for an edge. And when coaches are trying to develop, they are looking for an edge. They are looking for something, that a nugget, right? That's the word that gets thrown around. A nugget of information to take back to their team that's going to help them. Generally, those nuggets come from an X's and O's clinic. It comes from something that we would say is a top of the pyramid idea. And yet, when we look at our teams and the things that they have said will get in the way, none of it has to do with any of that stuff that is supposedly giving us an edge. So it's my belief that if we're doing it the right way, we have recruited our edge. That the people in the room are the edge that we're going to have. And if we've done a good job in recruiting, whether that's, youth, whether it's high school, college, pro, recruiting happens at all levels in the way that we define it. We are recruiting our edge every single day because we're recruiting our people every single day. And when we fail to do that, it doesn't matter what the standard is because we've now forgotten why we set those standards in the first place. And so thinking back to that experience that I was describing of everybody being really excited and there's this activation energy and people are really into it, the second part of that experience is probably a little more dark, where it's now the quote unquote dog days of the season, and you couldn't care less about the standards because you have to watch all that film. You couldn't care less about the standards that your team has agreed upon because we have to have shoot around, because we have to travel, because our flight is late, because of this, that, and the other. And we lament that we didn't spend enough time on tactical things in the install period of preseason. Whereas I would argue if we spent more time on the install of those standards and holding each other to account, again, in that neutral way of celebration and, helping to fix the issue, whatever it is, we would be so much better off come late in the season. Because tactically, if we already know what we want to do, because we do have that sound game model that you talked about, we do have those essential elements. Those are our standards of play, and we know what elite level play looks like. Now we can take more time to focus on elite level behavior that then drives those character traits forward, that then drives those consistent habits forward. And all of a sudden, we're looking at our team and they've achieved their own version of being elite, as opposed to comparing them to these outward facing or sort of these external formulas of what that elite performance is supposed to actually look like. So when you mention Tiger Woods, when you mention Kobe Bryant, you mentioned like UConn women's basketball, or even to Division III, like Hope College out in, I think they're in Michigan. Christopher Newport University, they were number one in the country this year, had really, really good players. They were undefeated until I think the Elite Eight or the Sweet 16 of the national tournament. Like, yeah, but we don't know what goes on behind closed doors with them. So we might go ask those coaches, like, hey, what do you do to do this, X, Y, Z? But the difference between that program and our program is going to be the people that's in it. Right. So the difference between the program that I have at the school I'm at versus Simsboro boys basketball or South County girls basketball or, Tri Village High School or any of these places that we do the work, like everybody's context is going to be different.
Hmm.
So our standard has to be directly applicable to the people in our situation, like in our place. And I think that's where like coaches want hard work. Players think that if they give that coach speak answer when whoever's asking them the questions about setting their standards or like how to get to this elite level of performance, they're just going to say what they think should be said without the reflective piece of, hey, what does this actually mean in our program? What's the language we are going to use in our program so that when we are trying to hold each other accountable, whether that's via celebration or otherwise, we're using our language. We're using things that are applicable to us where we are. And I think that takes like a significant level of awareness that coaches, and to speak candidly, coaches are not willing to go to that place because it's much, much easier to not have to be that introspective about the sporting experience and the environment that they are tasked with creating. And it's a sort of a long walk to get to the idea, especially when we're thinking about hiring and retention of coaches. This is really the crux of what needs to be asked is how do you do this? Everybody runs good stuff. And if you're confident in the stuff that you run, great. You could run flex, you could run concepts. I don't care what you do. This is the art of coaching. This is the art of teaching. This is the art of leadership that no matter what organization a coach is a part of, if they're able to take those things, the contextualized things, that introspective spirit, the awareness that it takes to create and mold these standards into factors of elite performance, they will be successful in everything that they do. But to say that the former player who was a really good player, who had a really high character, this, that, and the other, if they don't know how to articulate how they would create that environment, and they're then judging, like you talked about with Tiger Woods, Kobe, whoever, off of their own performance, nobody will ever touch their rosy view of how they were as a player until they reach that self-awareness to know that they weren't that person that they purported themselves to be, right? And I remember, and this is sort of the last thing about that part. I remember asking when I played at VCU, or not played at VCU, when I was at VCU as the director of player personnel, we asked like, what's your number one pet peeve? And beyond the coaches getting better gear than the players, their number one pet peeve was when we talked about our former teams and compared the current team to the former teams and compared specifically positionally player to player. And that shows you how much they cared about their own individual performance. And we sort of like say, oh, well, we don't care about your individual performance, whatever. People inherently want to be good. I think you said that earlier. Like they want to be good at whatever they're doing. And so when players tell us these things, it's high time that we listen to say, we are going to hold you to the standard of this group, not a group or a person that came before. Because there are two different groups of people. There are two different groups in general. There are two different individuals, and we haven't recruited them the same way because you can't do it the same way with everybody. So it's the human component still coming back as the foundation. That recruiting has to take place to the highest ideals of who we want to be. But we also need to be self-aware enough to know who it is we want to be and who we are right now.
So there's a couple things that you had in there. You talked about that I want to just go back to real quick. The nugget that people are searching for in the clinic or the DVD or the PDF or the Zoom call or whatever, and talking about how the people in the room is really what our edge is going to be. You go to that clinic and you find that nugget. The problem is that so did everybody else in that clinic. The problem is that everybody else that watched the DVD or is sharing the PDF or the show notes or whatever, they've all got the nugget too. And I think that's where egotistically we probably think, well, I'll utilize that nugget better than anybody else will because I'm smarter or I'm more tactical or I'm a better teacher or whatever. But if everybody is doing the same thing, if everybody is running the same offense in your state, if everybody is all of a sudden, because it's flavor of the week to, ice ball screens instead of hedge, all of a sudden, if that is sort of what we're going to do now and everybody starts to catch on to these fads, then that nugget doesn't separate you anymore. And the one thing that you have to control is, again, the people that are in that room. And I think ultimately what we're trying to say here is you want to eventually be the team that other teams can't prepare for. They can't scout your climate. They can't scout your culture. They can't scout your character. They can't scout who you are in that room and the people that are in the room. And then, yeah, we might get better offensively, tactically, defensively, tactically as we go throughout, the season. But the one area that we are going to improve the most, where our standard will be raised, is going to be the closeness, the recruiting, the connection, who we actually are. And come March, come the end of your season, that last game, whether it be the regular season, a playoff, or anything like that, I think ultimately the standard that is the standard that we've been working on all year long is who is actually in the room. And you can't prepare for that.